So today we're going to be looking at caring for your collection at home. So this is a pretty broad topic. And so we'll be looking at initially some general points and then looking into some environmental considerations, some storage considerations and how that reflects to individual object types. And then at the end, we'll be looking at the digital world and the new digital platforms that we all sort of deal with our collections. So preserving records means ensuring that they last for as long as possible. It's very hard to get things to permanently stop, but our aim is to get them to slow down as much as possible. My screen seems to have blocked. There we go. So there's two main ways that can be done. One is through preservation, which is what we'll be mainly talking about today, and that's looking at things like the temperature and humidity, controlling pests, the cleanliness, disasters, light and packaging. And the other is the more active form, which we call conservation, which is repairing, rebinding old volumes, cleaning, flattening, mounting. And that's usually done by a professional conservator and is best not done at home because there's a lot of risks involved with that. So first really big question that you need to be asking yourself when caring for your collection is, what exactly do you have? So do you have a big collection? Do you have a small collection? If you have a really big collection, you might think of having a catalogue and organising everything within that catalogue. And it's probably quite good to have more than one copy of that catalogue in case the original catalogue gets lost. Does your collection have a wide variety of materials? What sort of materials are in them? Different materials have different requirements. And so it's really good to know that. And it's really good for the catalogue as well in case of a disaster as well. So what conditions are your items in? So are they in good condition? Are they in poor condition? And just looking through initially and identifying which ones are in the worst condition. And the next one is a tricky question is, what's the value of the items that you have? Now, the obvious answer would be monetary, but that's not always the case because some things may be of low monetary value, but of high cultural or historical or often very high personal value. And knowing what those values are for different objects will help you really focus in on where you want to target your work. And what things you want to really repackage and what things you might want to save your money for to employ a conservator to look after. Also, having that sort of more narrowed list based on the value and the condition of things will also help ensure that you have things like your insurance forms up to date. And also in the case of a disaster, know which items that you want to take out first. So the environment. Well, the environment is one of the key determinants of how quickly things deteriorate in your collection. So while we cannot switch off electricity and light, but also okay, so where you keep your items in your collection is going to influence that type of thing as well. So ideally, your depository, your place where you keep a house, isn't going to be in a floodplain. It's not going to be in a bushfire zone or next to a big dirty factory, but we just have to be aware of those limitations. But even within our house or where we keep our objects, there's a few things that we would definitely recommend. So one would be to try to find a location which doesn't have external walls. Now, this comes back to what I was saying before about those environmental conditions, because an internal room will have less fluctuations in temperature and humidity because it's got the rest of the building to try to buffer it. Don't store items on the floor or on top of shelves. On the floor, there can be a trip hazard. If there's a flood, they'll get wet. On top of shelves, they can get more light exposure. They can get dust and dirt sort of landing on them. So I'd avoid that at all costs. So as I was saying before, try to have a cool and stable environment in which you can keep your collection, and try to control the light levels because light is another factor that will fade objects or discolor them. In a basic level as well, you can also want to have a functional fire and smoke detector in case of emergencies, and try to keep the area regularly cleaned as well. Yeah. So another important factor is I mentioned before about keeping them in an internal room, but try to pick a room that's going to be away from overhead pipes or area that is prone to get wet, area that's going to be close to, say, a bathroom where there might be steam coming out of it, or a kitchen which might have food there that may attract other pests. I'll talk more about pests a little bit later as well, because the food that we like, the pests will like as well, and it'll attract them as well. So it's for all of these reasons that we would really not recommend that you keep your collection in an attic or a garage or a basement. Yes. So temperature and humidity. So most materials will like a dry, cool conditions. Oh, sorry, I've just been told that my audio is not great. It's a bit better. I hope it's better. Um, Most materials will like a cool, dry condition that's stable. You don't want big fluctuations in those conditions if possible. I understand the limitations we all have. Ideally, for paper records, we recommend between 18 and 20 degrees and between 45 and 55% relative humidity. Avoiding places which are going to have lots of natural light, sunlight. So avoiding windows, front and back doors that are going to lead to fluctuations in that sort of temperature and humidity as well. Because I'll talk more later, but high humidity will lead to mold, and as well as other issues as well. So so just try to reduce the dust and the pollutants as much as possible as well. I'm not going too quickly here. We have a little bit to get through, so pests and mold. So these are sort of bane of a lot of collections, especially household collections. Pests can be all sorts of insects, cockroaches, silverfish, all sorts of things like that, and they'll vary upon the region that you are in Australia, and they will be attracted to food and warmth, just like we are. So that's why it's really important to have good housekeeping and to try to keep your collection away from areas like kitchens or dining areas where there may be food. Generally speaking, insect pests are going to be more active in spring and summer. And less so in winter, whereas your rodents, your mice, your rats, in autumn and winter, they're going to be looking for warm places to come into. We generally avoid having to use chemicals and instead monitor our areas where we have our collections and try to find out how they're coming in, block ways that they're coming in. So with that in mind, we should, and I was talking about mold before. Mold, just be really careful of mold, because as much as it's damaging for the collection, it's also a health hazard for people as well. So if you find a big mold outbreak, you might want to think about contacting a professional to handle it. Coming to recommendations, you should monitor during weather extremes, monitor for any signs of pest activity. So that might be signs of insect, wings, larvae, that kind of thing like that, little nibbles off things. Keep your storage area clean. And as I keep repeating, trying to keep your collection away from areas where there may be food and try to clean up food as much as possible. Air movement. Well, in humid areas where there is a big risk of mold actually quite likes dark, humid, still air. So if that's not possible in humid areas, maybe having air movement around that will help slow down or stop that mold activity. Now, light. Okay, so light damage is cumulative and irreversible, and it's a kind of a wide spectrum of wavelengths, and it's everything that we can see, but also ultraviolet light and infrared light as well. Ultraviolet light is particularly damaging at accelerating damage in collections, especially paper and organic materials. And it can accumulate either quite slowly or quite quickly as well. So these photos that you can see along the top, I think it's the blue dye has sort of gone from light damage, and you're just sort of left with a image on the left which is much more orange. The blue's gone in the green grass there, and you're sort of left with that yellowy orangey color. And it can be sort of quite slow as well, so almost imperceptible until a year later you look at it. And we've all seen sort of old newspapers that you've left in the sun and they become yellow and brittle. So just in your storage areas, and if you are displaying works, just be really aware of light. We would recommend that in your storage areas that you keep the lights out at all times unless you need to be in there. And sunlight is particularly bad because it's very high in UV light. So things like LED lights these days are actually pretty good. Halogens have a bit more UV light, and fluorescents can have quite a bit of UV light, although if you do have fluorescents, you can actually purchase UV filters for fluorescents or UV-free fluorescent lights. So I'd look at those if they're in those areas. Moving along, a bit to go through today. So, but in terms of basic principles, we should try to achieve cool, dark and dry environment that is as stable as possible, and to watch out for signs of any kind of pest activity, because they can get in through the smallest areas, and before you know it, they've gotten through eating the stuff in the kitchen and looking for other things to eat, and that may be your collection, and they're nesting and laying eggs or whatever horrible things they choose to do. So storage. Okay, so this is something that anybody can do with their collection, and it's something that is the first stop, I would say, for caring for your collection. So what to use, where to put it. So your packaging material acts as the first layer of defense for your collection. So it will act as a buffer for environmental changes, and in case of a disaster, it can go a little bit of the way to trying to mitigate the worst effects of it. Obviously, if the entire building burns down, it's not going to protect it, but in the initial stages, it can act as a bit of a barrier, which is great. So we would recommend to use a packaging material that is appropriate for the format. That would mean not too big, not too small, allowing easy access to the materials as well, and that it's archival. So archival means usually that it is not acidic. So again, acidity is another one of those factors like heat and light that can increase the rate of chemical reactions in your objects, which will lead to degradation. So an archival wallet or sleeve or box will help that slow down that rate of degradation. So I've gone over a few of those things there. So try to identify which of the items in your collection are most at risk from poor packaging. So that could be something small in a big box, something that is slumping within a box, or boxes that are really, really overstuffed and too tight, and there's that risk of them getting damaged by handling. Now, in an ideal world, we would have all types of bespoke packaging for all types of different items. That's not always the case, but on the NAA website and on the other websites of things like the library and museum, there may be links, and I know there is on the NAA website, to information about packaging materials and what we recommend. Also, the shelving. In an ideal world, it would be powder-coated metal shelving. They're strong, they're inert, but we understand there's always limitations if you've got an archive at home. So the packaging itself. So getting back to that very first slide I showed you about cataloguing, it's really good to know what you've got in your collection, but also to know where it is. So that will mean generally putting labels on the front of your boxes, and how you choose to label it, that is sort of up to you. You might choose to be in box 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but you may also want to put information on that label as well. So box 1, photos from 1960 to 1965, that type of thing like that. so that at a glance you can see what types of things are in there. At the archives, we have a system that is very more detailed than that, but we've got kilometres and kilometres and kilometres records, so it's going to be very different with your home collection as well. So the things to make sure for when you package things into your containers or your boxes is to make sure they're not too tight or too loose. So that means that they're not so stuffed into the box that there's a risk of damaging the items when you try to get them out of the container. If you've got files in a box, we generally recommend that you can fit your hand down one side. If you've got large things, physical objects in a box, there's space around the object so that you can get your fingers in there so you can get it out. But also there's a risk if items are there's not enough items in the box itself. It's a bit loose because the items might slump or end up resting on their side or diagonally, and that's going to be really bad. So we'd definitely recommend to chock the box out. So that might mean to get a bit of archival card, put it in there so that everything is straight, and then on the other side of that bit of card, put scrunched up paper or other bits of cardboard there, and that'll just help everything stay up a bit straight. So sometimes it involves just being a little bit creative about how you kind of pack things out in those boxes. When in doubt, you can consult the website of the National Archives, the NFSA, the National Library and the National Museum, about they will have links to ideas about packaging there. Labelling, yes, here we go. Very important because it's really good to have all that information just at a glance. So label your housing so you know what's what and where it's at. Now, also with your catalogue, you might want to put in your catalogue which boxes each of those items are in as well. So that if you need to find something, you can go, well, I'm after those photos, like I said before, from 1965 to 1970. Oh, they were all in box number 7. Okay, there we go, box 7. I found them all. And this might be an ongoing process for you as you bring things into your collection, or if you have to repackage things and move things from one box to another box. So you really want to keep on top of that and keep that sort of cataloguing and that location of where things are up to date, because it's only as good as that most recent information, because otherwise you run the risk of losing items just sort of within your collection if it's quite large. So we would say avoid labeling the item directly. Although context is really important for your collection and knowing your collection. I'm sure we've all found photos and we've looked at it and gone like, oh, I recognize grandma in that photo, but I'm not sure who the other people are. Having that contextual information is important, but at the same time, I wouldn't recommend just writing all over the back of the photo, and just keeping that information, as much of that information as you can. If you do need to write on the object, we would recommend writing on the back of it with a really soft pencil, say like a 2B graphite pencil. And one thing that might be useful is what we do at the archives is if we're going to be adding information, we put it in a square bracket, and that's like a little code sign for us to say, this information was added at a later time. This information wasn't created at the time the object was created. And so that way, anybody who looks at that goes like, oh, well, this information about, say, contextual information or cataloging information, because you might want to put a catalog number on the back of the item, was added later on when it came into your collection. Another thing you could do is to label a piece of archival paper or a slip and put it in between the pages of a file, and that way you're not actually writing on the object itself. Avoid things to avoid. Sticky labels, putting things on with sticky tape, putting a bit of white out on the bottom of a object and then writing on it, using pen, that type of thing like that, because they're all going to be really hard to get off if you need to get off, or if they start to go bad somehow, like they start to degrade and start to damage the object itself. Say sticky tape is really famous for that. Then you're going to be in trouble, and you will have actually sort of inadvertently damaged the object itself. Another little point might be, if you've got items in your collection that are really high significance, they are the gems of your collection. And if you say you're in an area which is prone to disasters, bushfires or flooding, you might want to keep all of your absolute gems in a box or a couple of boxes, and then have a symbol on the front of the box. I don't know, a gold star, a heart mark, something like that. And so in the event of a disaster, you know to rush in and grab that box or grab those 2 boxes and put them in the back boot of the car as you rush out. And that way it's a bit of a contingency for the collection. You won't be fiddling around with the collection going, oh, I really need to get this from this box or that from that box. You can just look on the outside of the box and you can see it straight away. So that's a little trick that might be useful. Now, what to put the objects in themselves? Plastics, not all plastics are born equal. Plastics is a general term for a wide range of polymer chemicals. Some are inert, which is what we recommend. We recommend an inert plastic, which means it's not going to chemically change, while others will become acidic with time, and again that acidity will damage the object within it. So we'll always use and recommend an inert plastic such as polypropylene, polyethylene, polyester. These have common names, Mylar, one, LDPE, which stands for low density polyethylene, and food grade plastics. Other ones that you might want to look out for are CopySafe, PhotoSafe, and acid-free on the products as well, because they're good signs that it's also an inert plastic. You're going to want to avoid PVC and vinyl. They will degrade over time, and they will signs that they're degrading will be things like if they feel a little bit sticky or sweaty, if they have like a bloom on them, sort of sometimes it can be a bit white or crystalline type of bloom. If they're discolored, if you see they're going a bit sort of orange, if they're wrinkling or cockling, that's a bad sign. Or if they smell of vinegar, or if they're just a little bit sort of smelly, weird, you might want to avoid those ones. But encapsulating things in plastic is a really good way of caring for your collection, because a lot of that risk that we have in collections is also with handling as well, unfolding, refolding, and the salts and oils from your fingertips as well. So putting them into a inert plastic encapsulate can be a really good way of protecting them and allowing access as well along. And that feeds very nicely into storing your photos, because a very common way of doing that is to pop them into an inert plastic sleeve or using inert plastic photo corners. So that would mean getting an archival bit of paper and then using those inert plastic photo corners, so that therefore that the handling isn't happening with your fingers, and you are handling with your fingers the plastic sleeve, the encapsulate, or the bit of paper that it's on. And then you can see on the slide there an example of a type of sleeve that you can kind of buy that can go into an album, into a ring album. And those sleeves can be in different shapes. That one has got two quite large ones, but you can get other ones for different size photos as well. So I'd recommend looking at the suppliers out there and what they've got, and see if it matches what you have in your collection, if you have a lot of photographs as well. So, and that's also the binder as well. So they'll sell inert plastic binders as well, because I know that there are some binders out there as well which are PVC too, or have PVC components within them. So the fingerprints can be damaging. So the fingerprint damage may not show immediately. So I'll talk about it a little bit later with metals as well. So and it's really clear in metal. So later on you go back, look at something after 10 years and there's a beautiful whirl or a loop of a fingerprint on it. You'll see similar things in some photos as well. So just be really aware of that. Negatives. So the negatives that come with them, now the technology and the chemistry around negatives has changed over the years. So first there was cellulose nitrate, which gets together with atmospheric moisture to make nitric acid. bad. And then that change to cellulose acetate, which gets together with atmospheric moisture to make acetic acid. Again, bad, both acids, and they will badly degrade over time, and they will release acidic gases, and they will damage objects around them. So I would not recommend keeping the negatives with the objects themselves. And what I would recommend is getting them digitized, those negatives, as high a level as you possibly can. While you're at there, hark back to what I said before, try to record as much of that contextual information for your photos as possible, because that's the stuff that provides the real meaning for those photos as well. A few things to avoid. Don't use what are called magnetic or self-stick albums. There's nothing magnetic about them. It's just a glue, and they will damage the photographs over time. Laminating is bad. You're basically putting a hot glue onto the surface of your objects. This is true for photos as any kind of paper object. And then with time, the chemistry of that glue may change. It may discolor. It may shift. It may move, and it may permanently damage your object. And once something is laminated, it can be quite tricky to remove it from that lamination. It can be quite a process. Big items. Not everybody will have this in their collection. This is an example of what we have in our collection, how we store things, which is really lovely, but I understand it's out of reach for a lot of people. We would recommend that they are stored flat, in folders, in cylinder boxes. If they're going to be in folders, please don't put too many in one folder. They can get very heavy very quickly, and then they can become a handling risk. So probably no more than 10 to 20 plans or posters or things like that per folder if you can. Plan cabinets are preferable to open shelving, because you can close them. There's less risk of pests, there's less risk of light or dust and that sort of thing like that. It's also good to interleave them if possible, because they themselves, plans may become acidic and start degrading the other plans around them. So you can interleave them, or you can encapsulate them in inert plastic as well. And you can get these sleeves in all kinds of sizes as well. So I encourage you to go out there and take a look at what the suppliers and the market have got. Very large items, so they can be a real issue. So they can be rolled on an archival core. Now, if you don't have an archival core, I would recommend wrapping that core in an inert plastic, a mylar or something like that, rolling it around the core and then wrapping it in, say, a buffered tissue if you can, and then popping it into a box. So that way it's got that barrier between the acidic core and your object itself. And that barrier layer of that inert plastic will go a way to prevent that sort of damage. But yeah, they can be really problematic in terms of space and where to store them. Textiles. Textiles is a really very varied domain. There are textiles conservators who specialize just in textiles. So if you have a really large textiles collection, I would probably recommend contacting a textiles conservator for advice, because there's a lot of different things there, and it's really to deal with all the details of that. Just like the metals is a little bit out of the scope for this little talk, but I will just talk in sort of basic sort of principles. So many of these suppliers will also sell textile specific boxes, so that can be really, really useful. The thing with textiles is to try to avoid creases and hard folds as much as possible. So try to put, if you can, try to pad those folds and creases out if you have to store them in a box and they have to be that folded in a way. So that may mean taking buffered archival tissue and rolling it or scrunching it up and putting it in those folds and creases so they're not so hard. And just trying to sort of make that more gentle, because those folds and creases, they can lead to weak points, which can lead to breakages and damages. For clothing, so again, so this is again a bit like the padded inert hangers. So they're padded so that there isn't that hard crease on that corner of the shoulder. So avoid wood, PVC or metal hangers and covers, and try to keep the objects flat with minimal folds and acid-free tissue in there as well as possible. Hats and purses, they can be lightly stuffed with tissue so that they retain their shape, and rolled textiles. Again, they can be rolled around a large diameter acid-free cardboard tube and then placed into boxes and then covered with archival tissue or a muslin protective cover. The one I've been talking a lot about keeping things acid-free. One thing I will say though is be careful of silk. Now, silk is itself proteinaceous. It's made by animals, so its degradation will actually be sped up by being in an archival environment. So if you have a lot of silk, you probably want to talk to a professional about the best ways to store your silk objects, because keep putting them in an archival environment will actually may be worse for them. So that's just one thing to be really aware of. Jewelry, metals, yes, and storing all of them. So I'm going to hark back to what I said before. Handling them can be a real issue. Salts, acids, and moisture can really accelerate the degradation. We have salts in our hands, in our sweat, in our fingertips. So we would definitely recommend handling them with latex or a nitrile powder-free glove. You're probably wondering why aren't we recommending cotton gloves? You see them all in the movies, the conservatives wearing them. The simple reason is that you lose tactile sense and agility with your fingers because they're a bit sort of more cumbersome, whereas those latex and nitrile gloves, you can retain that sense of touch a lot better. And they also actually provide a better barrier between what's going on in your hands and the object itself. So things to watch out for with them that speed up are salts, things like some cleaning fluids, so ammonia, organic acids, and they can be things that might be released from, say, wooden shelves. So the organic acids that will be off gas from wooden shelves can be a problem. And also in some textiles as well, say wood. Sorry, not wood, I mean wool. Wool can be a problem as well because it will release sulfur as well. So that can speed up the degradation of certain metals as well. Humidity, try to keep as low as possible. 35 to 55%, and try to keep it stable as much as possible. And yeah, RH as low as possible. And to avoid corrosion, different metals will have different mechanisms and different chemistries of corrosion. So as I was saying before, silver is particularly susceptible to sulfur, so it should be kept away from wool. And there is sometimes wool in some felts and things like that, which objects are stored on. So just be really aware of that. If you can get a synthetic felt instead of a genuine wool felt, that will go a long way. Copper will go green. Iron will rust. All of these things are to be aware of. So in general, try to keep your objects in acid-free archival materials. Interleave them with tissue, archival tissue as much as possible, and avoid overstuffing metal objects together, because if they are too tightly packed, there is the risk that they could scrape against each other or rub against each other, which could be a risk as well. Now, AV, a bit like metals, a bit like textiles, it's a huge domain in and of itself. So we're looking at things like magnetic discs. We're looking at film and sound, so it could be Super 8 or that sort of thing like that. We're also looking at CDs, records like LPs and EPs, so it's quite a broad field. So for magnetic, optical and groove discs, they last longer in a slightly cooler and more dry environment, and dust can be a real issue with them. And sometimes for some of them, light as well. So for magnetic discs, magnetic tapes, I should say, they're particularly susceptible to magnetic fields, as you'd expect. And they should be stored upright and not stored in the machine. And yeah, so that's the main things to be aware of. Another thing to be aware of them with magnetic and optical devices is the things that they play on. We're reaching a time where a lot of laptops won't come with a DVD player anymore, and the old tapes that we have, it's really hard to find a tape player and they're breaking and hard to replace. So for those things, you might think of migrating them to a digital format. So I'll move on to optical discs. They should be stored upright in a inert hard plastic case. They should be handled by the edges or by the central hole in the middle, but never your fingerprints actually on the flat of the disc itself. They are susceptible to UV light damage, so avoid UV light for them. And also pens. There are special pens to write on DVDs and CDs, and I would recommend using those because some pens the solvents will actually leach through from the back to the media, the information storage area, and damage that information. So if you're going to write on them, make sure you're always using one of those safe pens to do such. And avoid using labels on them as well, because you're not really sure what's in that adhesive, and that again might migrate through and damage the data that's in them. Grooved discs, so that's your LPs, your EPs, that sort of thing like that. So handle them by the edges. Store them upright, don't allow them to slump. So we would recommend having a board every 15 or so centimeters in between the discs to make sure that they all stay upright, and try to keep similar sizes together. So you don't intermix your big ones and your little ones. Have all your big ones together, have all your little ones together. And also one of the things to be careful with them on the shelving is that they can get really heavy really quickly. So make sure either they're spread out or that you've got really strong shelves. And yeah, so maybe just sort of look into that because the weight adds up on them very quickly. The inner sleeve inside them, the disc is stored inside, because you may wish to keep the outer cardboard sleeve because it's got beautiful artwork on it, fair enough. But the inner sleeve that the disc is kept in, you can actually get plastic sleeves that are going to be inert and not going to affect the disc itself. So I'd invest, if they're not inert, invest in some of those. So the basic principles for housing, it's to be inert, acid-free and archival quality, with the exception of silk. Ultimately, storage choices depend on the conditions of the items. And if you're unsure, seek a professional, I would say. Now, moving on to handling care. So this is all about actually physically dealing with the objects themselves, because that's why we keep them, is so that we can see them and enjoy them. So as I mentioned before, your fingerprints can be a risk to your collection. So that can be the salts in your hands, but it can also mean things like hand creams and moisturizers and things like that, because they can get on the item itself and leave smears and smudges. And the chemistry of those moisturizers and things like that can affect your object long term and lead to damage. So for this reason, we would recommend the powderless latex or nitrile gloves, if possible to use. Also, be aware of things like jewelry, rings and stuff like things like that, because if you've got a lot of objects, or big necklaces, they can sometimes sort of damage your object as well if you're not careful. Handling, I think I mentioned before, those folding, the unfolding, again, they can lead to weaknesses and brittleness in the object. So generally, if you can store the object flat, if you can have it in an encapsulate, then that will go a long way to preventing that damage. And having it in that encapsulate means that the force and the damage of the movement and your handling, a lot of that is dissipated in the encapsulate itself. It doesn't make it bulletproof, but it will go some way to protect the object within it. So yes, so ideally don't store objects folded and creased if you can. And when you're viewing objects, trying to do it in an area that's clear and there isn't a risk from nearby food or drinks or vases of flowers and things like that, so that there isn't that risk of an accident happening. It might happen, but just try to mitigate those risks and minimize those risks as much as possible. So the common culprits of damage. So outside of direct handling damage, these are things that we've seen in our collection, have come across our desks that people have used for storing and handling things that have inadvertently led to damage. Rubber bands being one, they'll dry out over time, they will stick to the object, they can stain the object. I would suggest replacing those with a cotton tape. So that's a strip of cotton that's sort of woven into a tape about 1 centimetre wide, and just sort of gently tying the objects with that instead. Sticky tape, generations of paper conservatives have been employed to remove sticky tape and to try to minimize the stain caused by sticky tape. So in the bottom left image there is a fine example of sticky tape damage. There's different formulations of different adhesives, so they're not all going to go orange like that, but there isn't really a great sticky tape out there, so I would recommend avoiding using sticky tape. Sticking things with glue is generally going to be bad. Most glue is proprietary, so it's really hard to know what's in it. PVA can be really bad. Once it dries, it's really hard to get off, so I would avoid gluing things as much as possible. Using pens, I think I mentioned before about using a soft pencil as a recommendation. Pens, they can sort of bleed through objects. They can be irreversible or very hard to get off. So I would try to avoid using pens if possible. Lamination. Lamination is basically applying heat-applied glue to the surface of your object, which makes it really hard to get off, and you don't really know the chemistry of that glue. It's not really a thing that you really want to have to deal with. Metal pins and paper clips, so they can be an issue. They can corrode themselves and leave stains. Sometimes in the top left, I'm not sure, so it's a little hard to see. That's a pink paper clip. It's got a PVC coating on it, and that PVC coating has sort of rubbed off onto the paper and left a mark. They left a stain there. So we would recommend using an inert plastic paper clip and a strip of paper. So sometimes what we do to try to disperse the force of the paper clip, get a strip of paper about 1 centimetre or 2 centimetres wide, fold it in half and put that over what you want to join together with the paper clip, and then put the paper clip over that. That'll go a little bit of the way to try to disperse some of that force, so you don't end up with a mark of a paper clip on there. Post-it notes, I don't know. Oh yes. So yes, staples as well, a similar problem. Post-it notes. So post-it notes, they can come off, and then post-it notes often have that contextual information. So once they've fallen off, you can lose all that contextual information. The adhesive in the post-it note, it can also act as a sort of a carrier for what's written on there. So I've seen cases where the pen that's written on the post-it note, it'll migrate through the adhesive that's in that post-it note and then end up on the paper below. And so you'll end up with a stain on the original document of what was written on the post-it note, which is, again, tricky to get off and can be a real problem. So I'd avoid using those as much as possible. If you need contextual information, I would recommend printing it with like a laser printer or something like that, and then keeping it with the object itself. And that way there isn't that risk of it coming off onto the object. Handling photos. So we talked a little bit about that previously. So I'm going to come back and repeat myself and talk about powderless latex and nitrile gloves, holding them by the edges or supporting them by a piece of paper, so that way you're carrying that bit of paper with the photograph on it. Obviously not in a windy environment or somewhere where they might blow off, but it just reduces that risk of your fingerprints actually getting on the object itself. If there's dust on there, you can use a blower or a soft brush to try to gently get that dust off there, because dust can be an issue with photographs long term. I don't know if you can see in that photo there, just above the man's head, there's a big whirly mark, and that was probably somebody's thumbprint, I'm assuming, or fingerprint. It's rather dramatic, but that's an example of the kind of damage that fingerprints can leave behind. Encapsulating them is a good way to avoid this sort of thing, because then your fingers and the salts on your fingers are going on the encapsulant, and they're not going to go on the photograph or the negative there. We talked a little bit before about cellulose acetate and cellulose nitrate. So if your negative smells like vinegar, that means it's releasing acetic acid, so which is vinegar. Or if it's going brown or greasy or cracking, or the image looks like it's washing away, that's probably cellulose nitrate because of nitric acid. So in those cases, that damage is going to be an ongoing process and it's not really going to be reversible. So I would digitize those negatives at as high a quality as you possibly can, and then consult with a professional if you can. And that way, what you have in that digital copy is what is like a snapshot in time before the negative degrades further and further. Because once it's gone, it's gone. There's unfortunately it's not CSI or a TV show where we can wave a digital wand over it and bring it back. So I would definitely recommend digitize to as high a level as you possibly can. Books. Yes, I don't know about you, but I've got too many. Store them upright or flat if possible. So if you are going to be storing them flat, please not too high a pile of books because that itself can be a risk if they're very, very heavy. So a low pile of books, but otherwise make sure that they are stored upright. And then not slumping or at strange angles because that can damage the binding, that can damage the spine, that can be a real problem. And also, when you're retrieving the books, please don't ever try to remove a book from the bookshelf by pulling from the top of the case, from that little area at the very, very top and popping your index finger in there and pulling it out. It's not actually made for that. It's not that strong. And I've seen many examples where that top area has sort of pulled off or there's tears in the binding around there. If you can, pull it from the side with two hands is a much better way of doing it. The other thing with books is don't try to force the binding. Don't try not to push the binding dead flat because there's the risk of cracking the binding, of breaking that binding. And I've seen it with people who are digitizing things. They try to squish that binding flat so they get a nice flat image and they end up breaking it. So don't try to do that. If you possible, you can use a book cushion. So a book cushion may be like a little mini bean bag with made out of a fabric which is not going to be damaging, say a muslin or that type of thing like that. And that way you can shape that so that you can have the book open but not dead flat. And so there's less stress on that spine. Yes. So a few other little tips. So don't use paper clips or dog ear a book. So or lick your finger to turn the page because there's your saliva is made to break down organic things, and paper is an organic thing, so it'll start to break down the paper as well and leave a stain and be generally bad. If you're going to put a paper mark in there, try to use an archival paper mark, an acid-free type paper mark, because you might put the paper mark in there and then forget and come back 10 years later. And if it was acidic, there may be a brown stain where that acidic paper was on the paper itself. Another thing to be aware of is with leather bindings. Be a bit wary of what are called leather dressings because it's not always clear what's in those leather dressings themselves, and they're often proprietary. So I would just be a little bit cautious about using a leather dressing. Another issue that you might see, depending on the age of the books, is what's called red rot. Sounds dramatic, and that's when the leather becomes very powdery and starts to come off on your hands. I'm afraid that's a result of the process of making the leather. It's the inherent part of that type of leather. So I would recommend encapsulating the covers if you can with a plastic, one of those good plastics. So that way the powdery leather isn't getting transferred onto your hands and then from your hands onto the pages inside. Excuse me. We're nearly getting there. I better hurry up. I'm nearly at the end. Digitization. This is the last bit. So about digitizing your collection. So why should you digitize? So to provide a copy and access copies for for yourself and the people who wish to use it. It's also to capture items that you know are going to be badly degrading in the future, like I said about cellulose acetate or cellulose nitrate negatives. The type of digitization that you use will depend on the type of objects that you've got. Flatbed scanners may be great for photographs or flat paper documents, but they mightn't be great for books, for example, because there's that risk to them as well. One thing to be aware of when you're digitizing things is technological obsolescence. So we talked a little bit about that with magnetic material and optical material, but also it's true with digital material as well. So things like the CDs that you might store the digital material on may eventually they mightn't be able to find CD drives or DVD drives anymore. The documents that you may have. So if it's like a born digital document, you may be concerned about an old version of Word mightn't be able to be readable or openable in 5 or 10 years' time. So I would consider that with the type of documents that you have, and think about every 5 to 10 years upgrading that. I think I'll talk about that more in the next slide as well. So the generations of the software as well as the generations of the hardware. So digital storage. So if you're really, really into the digital storage and you have resources and commitment, we say the 3-2-1 rule. So that would be 3 copies stored on 2 different media and 1 located off-site, away from where your general archive is. So that way you've got backups and things like that as well. So metadata. Metadata is, again, a bit like what we were talking about before in terms of, say, photographs and context. So it's that context around the material as well. So the who, what, where, and when around it as well. So without context, items lose value. Your data stops being information and it just becomes data. Long-term storage. So your USBs and your CD-ROMs are not long-term storage solutions. Hard disk drives, I've heard, are slightly better than solid-state drives because solid-state drives can lose their electrical charge. But I would recommend consulting a professional about this. Cloud storage could be another great way of looking at storing material as well, because it can be off-site as well. But depending on the size of your digital collection, it may get expensive. One last thing I might recommend with digital storage is to have a master copy and have an access copy. So your master copy may be in a, I think I'll talk about that in my next slide. Your master copy will be in a lossless format. So that might be a TIFF or a what was the other one? TIFF or a PNG. Whereas your access copy, which will be a smaller memory size, so that may be the thing that you open and close and you show a lot, that may be in a JPEG. So just be really aware, and that you don't access that master copy so often. It's also bigger in size, but that's where you use that for your smaller copies. That's where your derivatives, your access copies come from. And then you treasure and you store, you put a lot of effort into maintaining those master copies. So scanning. So a few tips around scanning. So make sure your platen, the plate that the digitization happens on is clean and dry between scans. You can use something like a lens wipe or something like that. Beware of crushing the objects. We talked a bit about books around that, and also to avoid auto feeders. Now that example, that picture there, that is when auto feeders go wrong. That is when probably a small tear in the side of the document got stuck in the auto feeder, and then it concertinaed horribly. And then you've got a bigger problem because you've got a mangled object. The standards for digitization, well, that can vary a bit depending on whether it's a photograph, whether it's negative, whether it's a paper document or not. So generally, standards for scanning are at 100%. 24-bit in color, and 300 to 600 DPI for photographs, and that depends a bit on the size, and 1200 DPI for negatives and for smaller photographs. Yes, so that's sort of what I go. But again, you may have limitations with the scanner that you've got and the resources that you have, but generally as high quality as you possibly can. Now, that brings us to the end. So if you need to contact a professional conservator, there's the AICCM, which is the Parent Professional Organisation for Conservators, the Australian Institute for the Conservation of Cultural Materials. And on their website, they have a link there called Find a Conservator, or is it? And in that, you can specify the type of conservator you're interested in, say textiles, and your area, and then they can make recommendations on who is available in your area. The NAA has information on its website about preserving or storage conditions under preserving the collection. And there's more general information there as well about looking after your family archive. And in that page, there are links to more specific information, say about photographs as well. So I recommend that. So thank you for your time today.